The bells began before she reached the doors. Not the gentle peal reserved for celebration, but a relentless, echoing toll that seemed to chase her down the cathedral aisle like a judgment she could not outrun. Silk whispered against marble as she gathered her skirts in trembling hands, her breath shallow, her pulse loud enough to drown the murmurs swelling behind her. Ilara Vale did not look back. To do so would have been to meet the eyes of 100 witnesses, ladies with jeweled throats and sharpened smiles, men who measured worth in alliances and obedience, and at the altar, the man she had been promised to as though she were no more than a signature upon a contract. A duke, a future, a life already decided. Stop her. The cry fractured the air, though whether it came from her mother or the officiant, Ilara could not tell. The sound struck her spine like cold rain, but still she ran. Past the carved pews, past the white roses that perfumed the suffocating space, past the future that had been arranged with such meticulous care that her own desires had never once been considered. The great doors loomed ahead, tall and unforgiving. For a single, suspended moment, she faltered, not from doubt, no, that had been burned out of her long before, but from the sheer enormity of what she was doing. A lady did not flee her wedding. A daughter did not shame her family. A woman did not choose uncertainty over security. And yet her hand rose. The doors opened. Wind rushed in, carrying the scent of rain and distant earth, wild and uncontained. It struck her face like a baptism, cold and bracing, and for the first time that day, perhaps for the first time in years, she drew a breath that felt entirely her own. Then she stepped through. Gasps rippled behind her, swelling into a chorus of disbelief that spilled out into the gray afternoon. The sky hung low and heavy, clouds pressing close as though eager to witness a transgression. Gravel scattered beneath her slippers as she descended the steps, heedless of the way her gown dragged, its pristine hem surrendering to mud. She has lost her senses. No, she has ruined herself. And the Duke, God help her, the Duke will not forgive this. The whispers followed, sharp as thorns, embedding themselves into her skin. Ilara did not slow. She could not. To stop now would be to surrender, to be gathered back into careful hands and returned to that altar like something misplaced rather than something unwilling. The carriage drive stretched before her, lined with black iron lanterns and manicured hedges that offered no refuge. Beyond it, beyond the gates, lay the unknown. It was not safety. It was not certainty. But it was hers. Her lungs burned as she ran, the corset beneath her gown tightening with every breath, a cruel reminder of the life she had been shaped to endure. Composure, obedience, silence, virtues instilled with the precision of a sculptor, chipping away until only what was acceptable remained. Until nothing remained. A drop of rain struck her cheek. Then another. Within seconds, the sky opened, and the world dissolved into silver streaks that blurred her vision and soaked her hair, her gown, her very resolve. Still, she pressed on, driven not by hope but by something fiercer, something born of quiet years and swallowed protests. Behind her, the cathedral doors thundered open. Voices rose. Footsteps followed. And somewhere within that growing chaos, there was one absence that should have been louder than all the rest. He did not call for her. He did not pursue. He did not shout her name across the distance as any wronged man might. The Duke of Blackthorn remained silent. That silence unsettled her more than any fury could have. Ilara reached the midpoint of the drive, her steps faltering at last as the enormity of her flight began to settle into her bones. The gates stood ahead, tall, wrought iron, their intricate patterns twisted into shapes that now seemed less ornamental and more forbidding. Freedom lay beyond them, if she could only reach them. She forced herself forward, each step heavier than the last, her slippers slick against the rain-soaked ground. The wind tugged at her veil, loosening it until it slipped free entirely, carried away like a final tether to the woman she had been expected to be. No one rushed ahead to intercept her. No one seized her arm. For a fleeting, fragile instant, she believed she might succeed. Her hand reached out, fingers brushing the cold iron of the gate. And then, with a resounding clang that echoed through the storm, it began to close. Ilara froze. The movement was deliberate, mechanical, inevitable. The gates did not slam in panic. They sealed with purpose, drawn together by unseen hands that understood precisely what they were denying her. No. The word escaped her lips, barely audible beneath the rain. She pushed forward, pressing her palms against the narrowing space, her breath hitching as the gap diminished inch by inch. Beyond, the road stretched empty and waiting, a promise now slipping beyond her grasp. "Please." The iron met with a final, unforgiving crash. Locked. The sound reverberated through her chest, through the hollow space where certainty had once lived. For a moment, she could only stand there, her reflection faintly visible in the dark metal, a bride undone, a woman suspended between defiance and consequence. Behind her, the world shifted. The distant clatter of carriage wheels grew louder, purposeful. Boots struck gravel in measured rhythm. Servants, no, not merely servants, men loyal to a single command began to position themselves along the drive, not threatening, not frantic, but resolute, controlled, orchestrated. A slow, dreadful understanding began to take shape. This had not been chaos. This had been anticipated. Ilara turned. Through the curtain of rain, a figure emerged at the top of the steps, unmoving despite the storm that soaked his dark coat and traced sharp lines along his form. He did not rush. He did not raise his voice. He simply watched. Even at a distance, there was no mistaking him. Adrian Blackthorne, the man she had justified, the man she had tried to escape. Something in his stillness unsettled the air itself, as though the world had paused to accommodate his presence. Where others reacted, he observed. Where others might rage, he calculated. And now, his gaze rested solely on her. Ilara's breath caught, not from fear alone, but from the strange, unyielding weight of being seen, not as a bride, not as a duty, but as something he had already chosen to understand. He began to descend the steps. Not hurried, not angered, certain. The distance between them felt suddenly smaller, though he had taken only a few measured strides. The men along the drive did not move, yet their very stillness formed a boundary more impenetrable than the gates behind her. She had run. She had defied. She had reached for freedom with both hands. And yet, as the Duke approached, rain sliding from the sharp edge of his jaw, his expression unreadable but his intent unmistakable, a quiet, devastating truth settled over her like the storm itself. She had not escaped at all. Rain threaded silver lines between them as he approached, each measured step closing the distance she had tried so desperately to claim. Ilara did not retreat. There was nowhere left to go that had not already been quietly denied to her. The iron gate stood sealed behind her, the men along the drive unmoving, and before her came the only person in this world who seemed entirely untouched by the chaos she had unleashed. The Duke of Blackthorne stopped an arm's length away. For a moment, neither spoke. The storm softened to a hush around them, as though even the rain dared not interrupt whatever passed in the silence between the defiant bride and the man she had publicly refused. Then, without warning, he removed his coat. The motion was unhurried, almost absent-minded, yet every eye upon the drive seemed to sharpen in response. The heavy black fabric, lined in deep velvet, carried the faint warmth of his body as he stepped forward and draped it over her shoulders. Ilara stiffened. It was not the gesture itself that startled her, but the intimacy of it. Not possession, not force, something quieter, more deliberate. The coat settled around her like a claim made without declaration, shielding her from the rain even as it drew the gaze of every servant present. "My lord," she began, her voice unsteady despite her effort to steady it. "You are shivering," he said, as though it were explanation enough. She was not from the cold. "I do not require your kindness," she replied, lifting her chin, though her fingers betrayed her by clutching the edges of the coat. "I require passage." A flicker crossed his expression, too subtle to name, gone before she could grasp it. "And yet," he said evenly, "you remain." The words settled heavily between them. Ilara forced herself to meet his gaze. "Because you have barred every exit." "No," he corrected softly, glancing past her toward the closed gates. "Because you chose to run before understanding where you stood." Something in his tone unsettled her more than anger would have. There was no heat in it, no wounded pride, only a calm certainty that suggested he saw further than she did, further than she wished him to. "I understand enough," she said, her voice tightening. "I understand that I was to be handed over like property, that my consent was never sought, and that your title grants you the right to decide my future without question." A murmur rippled faintly among the servants, quickly suppressed. The Duke did not look away from her. "And yet you ran," he said, not as accusation, but as acknowledgment, which suggests you do not accept such arrangements as readily as others might have hoped. His gaze dropped briefly to the mud staining her hem, the rain-darkened curls clinging to her face, the stubborn set of her shoulders. When his eyes returned to Hayes, there was something sharper in them, something assessing. "Tell me, Miss Vale," he continued, his voice lowering just enough that only she could hear, "if you had reached those gates, what then?" Elara hesitated. The answer should have been immediate. Freedom, escape, anything beyond this suffocating arrangement. But the truth was far less certain. "I would have found my way," she said at last, though the words lacked the conviction she wished they carried. "Alone?" he asked. "Yes." "In a world that has already decided what you are worth." His question struck deeper than she expected. "I would rather face that world on my own terms," she said, quieter now, "than live comfortably within one that denies I have any." For the first time, something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, approval. It was fleeting, but unmistakable. "Then perhaps," he said, straightening slightly, "we are not so opposed as you believe." Before she could respond, he turned. The movement was decisive, and with it came a subtle but immediate change in the atmosphere. The men along the drive stepped aside in unison, not to release her, but to clear a path back toward the estate. Elara's pulse quickened. "I will not return inside," she said sharply. "You will," he replied, not harshly, but with quiet authority, "not as a bride dragged to an altar, but as a guest under my protection." "I did not ask for your protection." "No," he agreed, "but you have it nonetheless." He extended his hand, not to seize her, not to compel, but to offer. The distinction should not have mattered, and yet it did. Elara stared at his hand, then at his face, searching for some sign of mockery, of manipulation, of anything that might make refusal easier. She found none. Around them, the world waited. The servants, the distant figures gathering at the cathedral steps, the whispers already beginning to swell beyond the estate walls, every moment stretched taut with expectation. If she refused, she would remain here, stranded between defiance and consequence. If she accepted, she would step willingly into the very place she had fled. Her fingers tightened against the borrowed coat. Then, slowly, she placed her hand in his. It was warm, steady, entirely unyielding. He did not tighten his grip. He simply toned, guiding her with quiet certainty back along the path she had tried to escape. The estate doors opened before them, servants bowing their heads as they passed. Inside, the world shifted from rain and chaos to candlelight and hushed elegance, as though nothing extraordinary had occurred beyond those walls. But everything had changed. She felt it in the way eyes followed her, in the way whispers curled through the corridors like smoke, in the way the Duke did not release her hand until they stood within the grand hall, beneath a glittering chandelier that cast fractured light across marble floors. Only then did he let go. "You will be given a chamber," he said, his tone returning to that measured calm. "Dry garments. Time to consider your position." "My position is quite clear," she replied, though her voice had softened. "Is it?" he asked. Before she could answer, a servant approached, carrying a small velvet box upon a silver tray. Elara frowned. The Duke did not look at the servant. His gaze remained fixed on her as he spoke. "Leave us." The servant obeyed, retreating with a bow. The box remained. Elara hesitated before reaching for it, her fingers brushing the soft velvet as she lifted the lid. Inside lay a ring, not the one that had awaited her at the altar. This one was older, its design intricate, its stone dark and luminous, catching the candlelight with an almost unsettling depth. She looked up at him, confusion tightening her chest. "I do not understand." "No," he said quietly, "not yet." His gaze flickered briefly to the ring, then back to her, something unreadable passing through his expression. "But you will." A distant echo of voices rose from beyond the hall, louder now, insistent. The scandal had begun, and as Elara stood there, the Duke's coat still draped around her shoulders, the weight of the unfamiliar ring in her hand, and his unyielding presence before her, a single, undeniable truth settled into place. He had not stopped her from running. He had simply ensured that wherever she fled, would still lead her back to him. Night settled over the estate with quiet authority that daylight could not command, smoothing the edges of scandal into something softer, more dangerous. The corridors dimmed to amber pools of candlelight, and the murmurs that had followed Alara throughout the afternoon dissolved into a distant, persistent hush, as though the house itself held its breath. She had not removed his coat. It lay around her shoulders still, its weight unfamiliar, its scent faintly lingering. Cedar and something darker, something she could not name but could not ignore. It felt less like warmth now and more like a question she had yet to answer. The velvet box rested upon the small table beside her, unopened since she had first revealed its contents. The ring within seemed to pulse with quiet significance, though she did not yet understand why. Understanding, she had come to realize, was something the Duke of Blackthorn dispensed sparingly. Alara rose. The chamber assigned to her was too grand, too deliberate in its comfort, as though ease itself had been arranged to disarm her. She crossed the room with measured steps, pausing only briefly before the mirror. The woman who stared back was not the composed bride who had entered the cathedral that morning, nor was she entirely the reckless figure who had fled it. She was something suspended between the two, and she needed answers. The corridor beyond her chamber stretched long and silent, its walls lined with portraits whose painted eyes seemed to follow her passage. Ancestors, no doubt, each bearing the same distant composure, each accustomed to obedience and control. She wondered, fleetingly, what they might have made of her, or of him. The library door stood slightly ajar. A faint glow spilled through the narrow opening, accompanied by the low, steady crackle of fire. She hesitated only a moment before pushing the door wider, stepping into the quiet heart of the estate. He stood with his back to her, one hand resting against the mantel, the other holding a glass he had not touched. Firelight carved sharp lines along his figure, catching in the dark planes of his coat, casting his shadow long across the room. "You have questions," he said, before she could speak. It was not a guess. Alara closed the door behind her, the soft click echoing louder than it should have. "You have given me little else to occupy my thoughts." He turned then, slowly, as though granting her the courtesy of his attention rather than reacting to her presence. His gaze settled on her with that same unsettling steadiness, as though he had expected this moment, had perhaps even waited for it. "Then ask," he said. The simplicity of it disarmed her more than any elaborate explanation might have. "Why?" she demanded, the words sharper than she intended, edged with all confusion and restraint she had held since the gates closed. "Why bring me back? Why dismiss the wedding, yet refuse to release me? Why place me in this house as though I belong here when I made it very clear that I do not?" He regarded her in silence for a moment, as though weighing not her words, but the force behind them. "You assumed this began today," he said at last. Her breath caught. "Did it not?" "No." The single syllable shifted something fundamental beneath her feet. He set the untouched glass aside, his movements unhurried, deliberate. "Your name was presented to me months ago," he continued, "along with your dowry, your lineage, your suitability. On paper, you were precisely what was required." "Required," she echoed bitterly. "How flattering." "And yet," he went on, as though she had not spoken, "paper is a poor substitute for truth." Ilara's fingers curled at her sides. "You speak as though you know me." "I know enough." Something in his tone, quiet, assured, ignited a spark of anger she could not suppress. "You know nothing of me," she said, stepping closer, her voice tightening. "You know what was written, what was arranged, what was expected. You do not know what it is to be offered without consent, to be measured and weighed as though your will is an inconvenience. You do not know what it is to stand before a future that has already been decided and feel. Invisible." The word fell from his lips with a precision that silenced her. Alara stared at him. He held her gaze, unflinching. "I know what it is to be surrounded by expectation," he said, more quietly now, "and to recognize that none of it accounts for who you are." Her breath faltered. "You presume much," she managed, though the strength had begun to ebb from her voice. "I observe," he corrected. The distinction unsettled her. "What did you observe, then?" she asked, almost despite herself. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he stepped closer, closing the distance he had created, though he did not touch her. The firelight shifted between them, illuminating the space that felt suddenly too narrow, too charged. "I observed," he said slowly, "that you never once looked at me during the ceremony." Heat rose to her cheeks. "I had no desire to." "No," he agreed, "you had none." There was no offense in his tone, only recognition. "I observed," he continued, "that your hands did not tremble when the vows were spoken, but when the doors were closed." Her pulse quickened. "I observed that when your father spoke on your behalf, you did not correct him, yet your silence was not compliance. It was endurance." Each word felt like a thread being pulled, unraveling something she had kept tightly bound. "And I observed," he finished, his voice lowering, "that when you ran, you did not look back." The room seemed to still around them. Ilara swallowed. "And from this, you concluded, what?" "That you were not refusing me," he said. "You were refusing everything that came with me." The distinction struck deeper than she expected. "I am not a symbol of your defiance," he added, "nor am I its cause." "Then what are you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Something shifted in his expression then, something unguarded, if only for a moment. "A man," he said, "who had no intention of binding himself to someone who would disappear the moment the door closed." Her breath caught. "And yet," she said slowly, "you bound me here instead." "I offered you a choice," he replied. "You closed the gates. I ensured you would not make a decision born solely of fear." His words lingered, heavy with implication. "Then give me that choice again," she said, her voice steadier now. "Open the gates. Let me leave." Silence stretched between them, taut and expectant. At last, he inclined his head slightly. "At dawn," he said, "I will have a carriage prepared. I will escort you beyond my lands myself, and you will be free to go wherever you wish." The certainty in his voice left no room for doubt. Relief should have followed. It did not. Instead, something far more unsettling took its place, a quiet, unwelcome hesitation that curled at the edges of her resolve. "And if I remain?" she asked, before she could stop herself. His gaze sharpened, something darker flickering beneath the surface. "Then you remain," he said, "not as an obligation, not as a bargain, but as a woman who chose to stay." The distinction settled between them, fragile and immense. Ilara drew a slow breath, her fingers tightening slightly against the folds of his coat. For the first time since she had run, the path before her did not feel forced. It felt open, and that, more than anything, frightened her. She turned toward the door, needing distance, needing air, needing to escape the weight of his word before they reshaped something she was not ready to surrender. "Dawn," then, she said quietly. "Dawn." He agreed. Her hand closed around the door handle, pausing only briefly. Behind her, the fire crackled softly, steady and unrelenting. She did not look back, but as she stepped into the corridor once more, one thought followed her with quiet persistence, refusing to be silenced. For the first time in her life, she had been given a choice, and she did not yet know which answer she feared more. Dawn did not arrive quietly. It pressed itself against the estate with a pale, insistent light, seeping through tall windows and slipping beneath doors as though determined to witness whatever choice would be made within its reach. Ilara had not slept. The hour between midnight and morning had stretched endlessly, each moment shaped by a single, relentless question she could neither silence nor resolve. Leave, and reclaim a life uncertain, unguarded, entirely her own. Or remain, and step into something equally unknown, yet bound to a man who saw too much and revealed too little. The carriage waited. She saw it from a window before she allowed herself to think, its dark form stationed at the edge of the drive, horses steady, driver unmoving. It was not hidden. It was not delayed. It was prepared, just as he had promised. Ilara's breath slowed, though her pulse refused to follow. The simplicity of it unsettled her more than any argument could have. No manipulation, no persuasion, only a path opened, and the burden of choosing it. She turned from the window. The chamber felt different in the morning light. Stripped of its shadows, its quiet intensity softened into something almost ordinary. The velvet box still rested where she had left it. The ring within seemed unchanged, and yet it drew her gaze with quiet insistence, as though it, too, awaited a decision. She did not touch it. Not yet. A knock sounded at her door. "Miss Vale," came the measured voice of a servant. "His Grace requests your presence." Ilara closed her eyes briefly. Of course he did. She followed the servant through corridors that no longer whispered, but watched. The air felt expectant, charged with a tension that had not been there the night before. When they reached the grand hall, the doors stood open, and beyond them, society had arrived. They filled the ballroom with a restless energy, silks brushing against polished floors, voices rising and falling in carefully contained waves. Jewels caught the light of the chandeliers, scattering brilliance across faces that bore equal parts curiosity and calculation. They had not come for celebration. They had come for spectacle. Ilara paused at the threshold, the weight of their attention settling over her before she had even stepped inside. Every eye turned, every whisper sharpened. She is still here. After what she did. Does she mean to claim him, then? Or has he already claimed her? The words coiled through the room, not loud, but unmistakable. She straightened. If she had once feared their judgment, she no longer had the luxury of retreating from it. She stepped forward, her movement steady, measured, each footfall echoing just enough to draw silence in its wake. At the far end of the room, he stood. Adrian Blackthorne did not command attention by gesture or voice. He held it by presence alone, a stillness at the center of motion, a quiet that rendered every other sound secondary. His gaze found hers without effort, as though he had known precisely when she would enter. There was no question in it, no expectation, only acknowledgement. Ilara crossed the distance between them, aware of every breath, every glance, every shifting current of speculation that followed her path. When she reached him, she stopped, not beside him, not behind him, but before him. "You sent for me," she said, her voice clear despite the weight of the room. "I did," he replied. He did not lower his voice. He did not shield their exchange from those who listened. "You have been given a choice," he continued, his tone even, carrying across the quiet. "It is only fitting that it be witnessed." A murmur stirred. Ilara felt it ripple outward, curiosity sharpening into anticipation. "My lord," she began, but he did not allow her to retreat into formality. "No titles," he said, not unkindly. "Not now." The simplicity of the command steadied her. From the edge of the crowd, movement caught her attention. Her father. His expression was drawn tight with controlled anger, his steps quick as he approached, each one cutting to the gathered guests with a force of expectation long denied. "This has gone far enough," he said, his voice low but carrying. "Ilara, you will return with me at once." A familiar pressure tightened in her chest. For a moment, the past pressed in, the years of obedience, of silence, of measured compliance that had shaped her into someone acceptable, someone presentable, someone who did not disrupt the order of things. "You have embarrassed this family beyond repair," he continued, his gaze sharp, unyielding. "Whatever defiance you believe yourself capable of ends here." The room still further, drawn taut by the confrontation. Ilara did not look at the Duke. She did not seek his permission, his protection, or his intervention. She stood alone. "No," she said. The word was quiet. It did not need to be louder. Her father's expression hardened. "You will not speak to me in such a manner." "I will speak," she replied, her voice gaining strength, "in whatever manner allows me to be heard." A flicker of surprise passed through the nearest faces, quickly masked but not entirely concealed. "You forget yourself," he said coldly. "No," she answered, meeting his gaze fully. "For the first time, I remember." The silence that followed was absolute. "You arranged my future without my consent," she continued, each word deliberate, each one laying bare what had long remained unspoken. "You offered me as though I were a solution rather than a person. And when I ran, you called it disgrace. I call it refusal." Her father stepped forward, his hand tightening as though to seize her arm. He did not reach her. The Duke moved then, not quickly, not forcefully, but with a quiet precision that placed him between them without seeming to intrude. "You will not touch her," he said. There was no raise in his voice, no visible threat, and yet the command settled with undeniable weight. "She is my daughter," her father snapped. "And she is not your possession," the Duke replied. The distinction hung in the air, sharp and irreversible. Ilara felt something shift within her, something long restrained now given space to breathe. The Duke turned to her then, his gaze steady, unguarded in a way it had not been before. "The carriage waits," he said. "A single sentence, a single choice. You may leave," he continued. "No consequence will follow you from this house." His hand lifted, not to claim, not to compel, but to offer. "Oh," he added, his voice softening just enough to belong to her alone. "You may remain, not as obligation, not as arrangement, but as yourself." The room held its breath. Ilara looked at his hand, then at the door beyond the gathered crowd, where the world awaited her return, then back at the man who had seen her when she had believed herself invisible. The weight of expectation pressed from all sides, the memory of freedom cold from beyond, and between them, a choice. Slowly, deliberately, she stepped forward, not toward the door, toward him. Her fingers brushed his, then settled. Gasps broke the silence, sharp and immediate, rippling outward like the first crack in something long held intact. Ilara did not look away. "I will not return," she said, her voice steady, carrying through the room with quiet certainty. "Not to a life where I must ask permission to exist." Her grip tightened, not in desperation, but in resolve. "I choose this," she continued, "whatever it may become." The Duke's hand closed around Hayes, firm, unwavering. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt. And then, from somewhere within the gathered crowd, a voice rose, low and edged with disbelief. "You choose him after all this?" Ilara held the question in silence. Then, softly, with a calm that surprised even herself, "I choose myself." And for the first time, the scandal was no longer about what she had done, but what she had become. The silence that followed her declaration did not shatter. It shifted. It drew inward, tightening around Ilara and the Duke as though the world itself had recoiled, uncertain whether to condemn or witness what had just been irrevocably set into motion. The chandeliers burned steadily above, their golden light unchanged, yet everything beneath them felt altered, fragile in a way that demanded resolution. No one spoke at first. Then the whispers returned, not tentative now, but sharpened, emboldened by the enormity of what had been chosen in plain view. Names were exchanged, reputations weighed, futures recalculated in murmured fragments that moved like a tide through the room. "She has cast herself beyond redemption. He will regret this. Or perhaps he never intended otherwise." Ilara heard them all. This time, she did not flinch. The Duke's hand remained closed around Hayes, not restraining, not guiding, simply present. It was a steadiness she had not known she could lean upon, and yet she did not lean. She stood upright, her spine aligned with a quiet resolve that had taken root somewhere deep and unyielding. Across from her, her father had not moved. The anger that had once animated him had settled into something colder, more calculating. His gaze shifted between her and the Duke, measuring, assessing, as though the moment might yet be reclaimed through force of will alone. "You believe this ends in triumph," he said at last, his voice low, deliberate. "It does not. You have severed yourself from everything that secured your place in this world." Ilara met his gaze without hesitation. "Then I will build a new place within it." "You?" he asked, a bitter edge threading through the single word. "With what standing? What protection?" Her fingers tightened slightly within the Duke's grasp, not from fear, but from the weight of the question. "With my own," she said. The certainty in her voice did not waver. A flicker passed through her father's expression, something between disbelief and reluctant recognition, but it hardened quickly into resolve. "Then you are no longer my concern," he said. The word struck with the force of finality. For a moment, something within her trembled, not doubt, not regret, but the quiet ache of a bond broken beyond repair. It passed swiftly, leaving behind a clarity that felt almost startling in its purity. "Then we are agreed," she replied. He held her gaze a moment longer, searching perhaps for hesitation, for weakness, for the daughter who had once bowed beneath expectation. He found none. With a sharp tone, he withdrew, the space he left behind closing quickly as the crowd shifted, absorbing the absence, recalibrating around a new center. The scandal had reached its peak. Now, it would either consume them, or transform. The Duke released her hand then. The absence of his touch was immediate, noticeable, yet it did not unsteady her as she might have expected. Instead, it left room, space enough for her to stand entirely on her own, not as an extension of his will, but as a choice she had made without coercion. He stepped forward, his presence reclaiming the attention of the room with effortless authority. "If there are any doubts," he said, his voice carrying with quiet precision, "they will be addressed now." The murmurs faltered. No one interrupted. "This matter concerns no arrangement," he continued. "No negotiation, no exchange, no obligation enforced by title or expectation. Miss Vale stands here by her own decision, and she remains by that same right." His gaze moved across the gathered faces, steady, unflinching. "Should any find fault in that, they may remove themselves." The challenge was unmistakable. No one moved. Not immediately, but something subtle shifted, a recalibration of power, a recognition that what had occurred could not be undone by disapproval alone. Ilara watched him, not with awe, but with a growing understanding. He was not shielding her. He was making space for her to stand. The distinction mattered. A woman near the front, a lady of evident rank, her expression composed but keenly observant, inclined her head slightly. "A bold declaration, Your Grace," she said. "One that will not be easily forgotten." "I have no desire for it to be," he replied. The exchange lingered, its implications settling into the fabric of the room. This was no quiet resolution. This was a line drawn. Ilara stepped forward then, the movement instinctive rather than planned. The attention shifted once more, settling upon her with renewed intensity, but it no longer felt suffocating. It felt earned. "I did not come here to be defended," she said, her voice steady, clear, "nor to be hidden from consequence. What I chose knowing precisely what it would cost." A ripple moved through the crowd. "Then you accept that cost?" the lady asked. Ilara met her gaze. "I do." The answer was simple, unadorned, unyielding. Something like respect flickered across the woman's features before it was carefully concealed. "So be it," she said softly. The moment passed, but its impact remained. The tension that had once threatened to fracture the room began to ease, not dissipating, but transforming into something quieter, more contemplative. Judgment had not vanished, but it had lost its sharpest edge. Ilara exhaled slowly, a breath she had not realized she was holding. Beside her, the Duke spoke again, though his voice was lower now, meant only for her. "The course will not end here." She turned to him, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "I did not expect it to." A faint shift touched his expression, not quite a smile, but something close enough to soften the severity of his features. "Nor did I," he said. For a moment, the world beyond them receded. The whispers, the watching eyes, the weight of society pressing in from every side. There was only this. A choice made, a consequence accepted, a future uncertain, yet undeniably theirs to shape. The doors at the far end of the ballroom opened then, the morning light spilling inward, pale and steady, illuminating the path that led beyond the estate. The carriage still waited, unclaimed, unnecessary. Ilara glanced toward it, just once. Then she looked away. When her gaze returned to the Duke, there was no hesitation left within it. "Tell me," she said quietly, "what becomes of a woman who refuses a life chosen for her?" He regarded her for a long moment, as though measuring not the question, but the strength behind it. Then, with a calm certainty that settled deep within her chest, he answered, "She becomes the author of her own." The words did not promise ease. They did not promise acceptance. But they offered something far more enduring. Truth. Ilara inclined her head slightly, not in submission, but in acknowledgment. "Then I suppose," she said, her voice carrying a quiet, unshakable resolve, "it is time I begin writing." And as the murmurs of the room reshaped themselves around her, not as a fallen bride, but as something far more formidable, the world she had once fled did not close in upon her. It opened,